Well, we'll see if this comes as a surprise to anybody. This was one of my favorite movies growing up. Even as an adult, I still get a lot of fun out of it. Then again, it seems like the more I talk to other people, the more it feels like I just never really grew up. Kind of ironic now that I think about it. All the same, when I saw this book at a thrift store, I wanted to know how it compared. And plus, there's just been so many iterations of Peter Pan over the years. I was kind of curious to see what the original was like. Probably the first thing to note about this book is that there are actually two different stories contained within. The first one is Peter and Wendy, which is the story that most people know. And the crazy thing about this story is that J.M. Barrie originally wrote it as a play, but then later adapted it into maybe a novella, something like that. It's kind of short to call it a novel. And then the second story is known as Peter Pan in Kensington Garden. This is basically Peter Pan's origin story. In general, this book is just all over the place tonally. It makes me think of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales and the idea that they're short little adventures that you can read the kids before they go to bed. But a lot like Grimm's fairy tales, there is a bit of a darker edge to it. For instance, when they first start discussing Peter Pan, one of his origins is that when little kids died and went to heaven, Peter Pan was a sort of angel that made the experience seem a lot less scary. Another really big example as well is that while in the Disney movie, nobody dies, the book actually has a pretty high body count. Characters are pretty much the same in both. You got Mr. Darling, who's a bit of a logical thinker that many would consider a stick in the mud. In the book, he is talked about as being very ruled by logic. So much to the point that Mrs. Darling actually needed to convince Mr. Darling to keep the kids. Wendy was the easiest, but as the kids kept coming through and finances started to dry up a little bit. So it got a little scarier by the time we got the poor young Michael on the scene. Mrs. Darling plays the part of the typical loving mother, but is also mentioned to be a bit of a control freak, as every night when the kids go to bed, she picks their brains to just try to make sure all the random thoughts they have are aligned perfectly. Wendy is kind of a mixture of both of the parents. Rather logical, but also loving as well. And then you got John and Michael, who, unlike the movie, are basically just along for the ride. I mean, I get the idea that the name of the story is just called Peter and Wendy, so it would make sense you would put a lot of focus on both of them. But there's barely any personality for John or Michael whatsoever. They're just there. Much like in the movie, Peter Pan would often fly up to the nursery to be able to hear about some epic stories. In the book, it's ironically Grimm's fairy tales, and Peter Pan was always very curious to know what happened to Cinderella, another Disney movie. Well, in the movie, it was Wendy who was telling the stories, and they were all about Peter Pan. This idea that Wendy was a bit of a lore master is not in the book whatsoever. That was made up entirely for the movie. One night, Peter just got a little too close to the nursery when Nana, basically Mr. Darling, wanted to keep up appearances with his neighbors. When all of his neighbors had nannies to be able to take care of their children, he wanted one as well. However, due to his financial situation, he couldn't afford a human nanny, so he got a really well-trained dog, just like the movie. So one night, Peter just gets a little too close to the window when Nana takes his shadow away. What's interesting is, unlike the movie, it was actually Mr. and Mrs. Darling that found the shadow, other than Wendy. However, in both versions, the shadow ends up inside a dresser drawer, but not before the parents tried to decipher who this shadow belonged to. And Mr. Darling not liking it whatsoever, as he very much looked a bit like a scoundrel. A few nights pass, and the Darlings are invited to a party. It plays out pretty similar in both, in that the idea that the dad left the house in a rather bad mood. However, the book has a lot of different details as opposed to the movie. So in the movie, the dad is rightfully annoyed because the kids kind of kept stealing his stuff and using it in their little games to play the part of being in Peter Pan's Neverland. When he trips, he is rather annoyed that the family cares more about the dog than Mr. Darling. So it's kind of similar here. Basically, with all of Mr. Darling's skill, he just never figured out how to be able to tie a tie. And he always found it so degrading to ask for Mrs. Darling to be able to do it. But after basically using up all his patience and about 50 attempts to do so, he breaks down and asks her to do it, which puts him in a foul mood. The kids seem to be going to bed as usual when Michael, the youngest, refuses to take his medicine. To which the dad says, "When I was your age, I took that medicine and I was proud of it. In fact, the medicine I have to take is far worse than anything you'll ever take." To which Wendy says, "Okay, well, how about you take both medicines at the same time?" While Mr. Darling was putting up a front for this, he hates taking the medicine just as much, if not more, than Michael does. So, as a way to try to get out of this, he hid his medicine bottle as well as he could. But Wendy was able to spy it and brings it in. To which Mr. Darling just keeps saying, "You have yours first, and then I'll have mine." And then it's just a stare-off of saying, "No, you drink yours first, and then I'll drink mine." To which Mr. Darling, under the guise of a joke, pours his medicine into the dog's dish. To which, just like the movie, the family is rightfully on the side of the dog. And Mr. Darling is rather furious about this and has her tied up in a rope outside the house. With both of the Darlings at the party, Peter Pan comes back for his shadow, but tries to go really stealthy not to awaken any of the kids, and also just to make sure that Nana doesn't come back to take the shadow away again. Peter looks all over the place to try to figure out where the shadow is. Now, in both versions, he does find it in the drawer, but here's where it's very different. In the movie, there is a ferocious fight to be able to get the shadow to agree with him. Here in the book, though, the shadow seems to stay around all right, but Peter just can't find any way of attaching it. In both, he resorts to trying to use soap to stick it on. In either version, I still don't know how this is possible. But since that doesn't work, Peter breaks down and cries because he just feels absolutely hopeless. But this crying wakes up Wendy, to which she asks, "Why are you crying, little boy?" And Peter, wanting to keep up appearances of a strong boy, says, "I wasn't crying, although if you could help me get this shadow on, that would be a lot of help." To which she brings out her needle and thread and sews on the shadow. Similar in both versions, but here probably the biggest difference is Peter and Wendy are basically the same age in the book. While in the movie, I feel like Peter Pan is just on the gateway to adolescence, while Wendy is maybe 2 or 3 years younger than that. And on top of that, Peter Pan is just not really a big fan of girls in the movie. While in the book, it's not so much that he doesn't like girls, it's just he hasn't really had much of an opportunity to find any. He always wanted to have a girl to be able to act the part of a mother, but also he finds that girls are rather brilliant. So in the book, the Lost Boys are basically a group of boys that fell out of their carriage when they were young, and Peter took them into his care. However, he states that there's no lost girls, not because he thinks girls are icky, but because they're just too smart to be able to fall out of the crib. With the shadow back on, we are introduced to Tinkerbell, and there's actually quite a lot of building in terms of the world of the fairies. So, the way the fairy was born, when a newborn baby laughs for the first time, its breath breaks apart into 1,000 fairies. The fairies don't live for very long, and they can also die if anybody utters this phrase. There actually are fairies. I don't feel right in killing how many people smash that replay button. But here's probably the thing I find the craziest out of the fairy lore. The color they are is what their gender is. The mauve ones are boys, the white ones are girls, and the blue ones are just little sillies who are not sure what they are. Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see some sort of non-binary reputation back in the early 1900s. We are also told Peter's story, which is very similar to how it appears in Hook. Basically, Peter realized that if you grow up, then you have to grow old. And Peter Pan simply didn't want to do that. He wanted to just stay young and have fun. So he ran away and lived in Kensington Park. That is where he ran into the fairies, which were able to help raise him. The story is later expanded upon in Peter Pan in Kensington Garden, but I will get to that. Now in both, Nana tries her best to be able to protect the kids. Both end up barking incessantly, trying to get Peter Pan. But in the book, it happens a lot differently. Unable to be able to get Peter Pan away from the kids, she breaks her rope and runs as fast as she can to the party that the Darlings are at. She is able to find the Darlings. Both of the Darlings stare at each other and realize something must have gone horribly wrong, and immediately run as fast as they can back for home. And about the 10 minutes that it takes the Darlings to get back home, Peter Pan works on telling the kids how to fly. All it requires is a little bit of fairy dust. And notice that I said fairy and not pixie dust. I don't know why they say pixie dust here, as the word pixie is never even in the book. And a happy little thought, and that's all you need to be able to fly. The parents run home as fast as they can. They break the door down just in time to see all the kids fly away off into the distance with this ruffian. Both just have breakdowns over this, and both think that they're the ones to blame for all this. Now, unlike the movie, where the trip to Neverland seems to only take a few minutes, the book seems to have happened for several days. In fact, Peter had to teach the kids how to be able to eat, as well as how to be able to sleep while flying. So by the time they get to Neverland, they are just completely exhausted. Now in both, Tinkerbell is very jealous of Wendy and leads her into a trap while Peter Pan takes the boys elsewhere. In both, Tinkerbell convinces the Lost Boys that Wendy is actually a bird that Peter Pan told them to shoot down. Now, unlike the movie where a few things nearly graze her and then Peter saves her at the last minute, in the book, she is hit and she goes down. So when Peter arrives on the scene, he's wondering what in the world they shot down, until he realizes that they shot down Wendy. Wendy was meant to be a mother for them. This is a very big deal, as Peter Pan's #1 rule is that you cannot talk about mothers. Obviously they do whenever Peter's not around. And through little whisperings here and there, Peter Pan realizes that they do want a mother. So that's what Wendy was for. So the Lost Boys bring the body forward, to which everybody is just disturbed at the idea that they killed her. However, she was saved. Peter Pan gave Wendy the gift of a little acorn that Wendy wore around as a necklace, right over her heart where the arrow went in. The arrow actually went into that acorn and not into Wendy. So she is still alive, but obviously very tired from not only all the excitement, but also just the incredibly long journey to get there. We talk a little bit about the story of the Lost Boys. Now, what's interesting is that some of the Lost Boys have died in their confrontation with the pirates, and a few of them actually rather decided to grow up, to which that immediately kicked them out of the group. The Lost Boys live underground with a series of great trees being the only entranceways into this underground house. However, we don't go there yet. Peter Pan instructs the Lost Boys to be able to make a little house for Wendy until she has recovered from all this. The house is completed by the end of the day, while Peter Pan sits outside keeping watch. After this, Barrie mentions a whole slew of adventures that went on while they were there. But he decides to tell one in particular. The island of Neverland is inhabited by several groups. You got mermaids, you got Native Americans, which both the book and the movie have a rather politically incorrect term for them, the pirates, and the Lost Boys. While the Lost Boys are playing with the mermaids, all of a sudden a dark shadow appears. In its wake is Smee and Starkey, and their captive, Tiger Lily, the chief's daughter. They head out to a place known as Marooner's Rock. Now how this works is that they place their victim on the rock, tied up in such a way that they wouldn't be able to swim. Now, they would be perfectly fine on the rock, but as the tide comes in, it slowly starts to rise into the point where the water would be over their head and they would slowly drown. Even if they were able to break their bonds, it's still too far away to be able to swim back to shore. This, according to the natives on the island, is the worst possible way to die because there is no path through water to the happy hunting ground. I do love the idea that that quote still made it into the movie. The reason for her capture is that in the middle of the night, Tiger Lily went aboard the Jolly Roger, the pirate ship, and attempted to slew a whole bunch of them. However, she was only able to get a few off before she was tied up and then sentenced to the rock. Peter comes up with a plan to imitate their captain, Captain Hook. Which, how on earth have I gone through this video so long and haven't even talked about him yet? His first name is James, although it's shortened to Jas sometimes for some reason. I don't get it either. And his last name isn't actually Hook, but that's the nickname they gave him. So, pretty similar premise there, is that Peter Pan ripped off Captain Hook's hand, although in the book it is described as his whole arm, and then feeds it to a crocodile. The crocodile loved the taste of him so well that constantly be following him. However, a stroke of luck. The crocodile ate Captain Hook's alarm clock, and so every time crocodile comes close, there is a bit of a ticking noise to be able to give Hook a warning to get away. So unlike the movie, they touch upon the idea that this clock is a wind-up clock, and eventually it will unwind, and the crocodile will eventually take over Captain Hook without him ever hearing it. With this, understandably, Captain Hook has had quite a vendetta in trying to kill Peter, and they've had quite a bit of a back and forth over time. Get back to the story, though. Peter does a very convincing job at pretending to be Captain Hook. So, unlike the movie, where the captain is already there on Marooner's Rock, to be able to tell of the ruse and wonder why in the world they're freeing Tiger Lily, in the book, Captain Hook swims out to them to see how everything is going. How in the world he's able to do that with only one hand is never really explained, but obviously Hook says to put Tiger Lily back. However, from there, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys reveal themselves, and an epic battle ensues. They are able to free Tiger Lily and bring her back to the chief. However, the battle has both left Peter and Wendy very tired and left just sitting there on Marooner's Rock. Wendy is able to escape because one of Michael's old kites is able to carry her back to the mainland. It's made very clear that Neverland is basically the collective imagination of children everywhere, so I'm not going to question this logic. Peter Pan, however, finds his way off the island after this Neverbird comes by with a nest and says, "Here, you take it," and then uses that nest as a boat to be able to get back to the mainland. This little adventure actually turned out to be quite fruitful, as now the Native Americans are very grateful for saving Tiger Lily, and have thus promised their protection in the case that Captain Hook will want his revenge. So they kept a constant vigilance over the entrance to the underground house. During this time, Wendy has taken over the role of loving mother. She would be sure that the boys all got to bed at the right time, that they would all take their medicine, which was really just water because they didn't have any. I would also say that she would cook as well, but they didn't have any food, so they just used their imaginations, and that was enough to be able to fill them up. As a reward for good behavior, she would tell them bedtime stories. Their favorite bedtime story was how Wendy made it to Neverland, and the idea that she wanted to go back. In both the Lost Boys, Wendy, John, and Michael all immediately want to go home. However, the pirates had other plans and decide that night to invade the house. What is different is that several of the natives protecting the house have been killed or driven away by the pirates. And because the house is practically soundproof, none of the Lost Boys are able to hear any of this. All the boys are rounded up, to which Peter just kind of sits there in bed saying, "It's all your fault. I'm just going to stay here and be young like I always have." As Peter Pan is sleeping, Captain Hook sneaks into the house, to which he is able to spy the medicine bottle. He then spikes it with a collection of poison that he's collected all over his voyages. After a good night's sleep, Peter thinks that he was just too hard on Wendy and the boys, and decides to respect Wendy's wishes and starts to take his medicine. However, just then Tinkerbell comes in, warning Peter that the medicine is poisonous and that Hook poisoned it, to which Peter just refuses to accept this. So he decides to take a big gulp, but Tinkerbell gets right in the way and downs the toxic brew all in one gulp, and slowly starts to fade away. However, there's a way to bring fairies back. If you clap really loudly, that will revive a dying fairy. Now in the play, this made a bit more sense in the idea that there'd be some audience participation. The audience would start clapping or do whatever they wished. However, here in the book, Barrie says that Peter Pan somehow sent a telepathic message to all the kids of the world saying, "Hey, you should clap, be able to save Tinkerbell from dying." As you can tell, that's pretty similar to the movie. However, I can see why they went with the explosive instead, as that was a way to be able to cripple Tinkerbell, but not at the idea of Peter being poisoned. From there, Peter realizes that either Hook or him has to go, and that is the mentality he takes as he goes to invade the Jolly Roger. Now along the way, he finds the crocodile and realizes that the clock has finally sprung as there's no longer any ticking. However, the sound of this ticking has been known to drive Captain Hook insane and almost kind of cower like a little child. So as he boards the ship, he makes the clicking noise to be able to disguise himself as the crocodile. Now before this, with all the Lost Boys, Wendy, John, and Michael aboard the ship, Captain Hook offers some of them the ability to become cabin boys. However, he only has room for 3 people, and all the others must walk the plank, which here it's described as being a lot more deadly, as there's like sharks in the water, there's crocodiles. You're not going to come back up even if you did somehow break your bonds and swim. All of them are strong though, and decide not to go for it. However, Hook tries another form of persuasion. I guess they have some sort of feral cat on board that he attempts to torture them with. However, with each person who tries to go get the cat, there is an awful shriek and nobody ever comes out. After about 3 people in, Hook goes himself to convince them that the ship has not been cursed. When Hook does come out, he realizes that his lantern has been blown out, and all the people that went in are dead. This was Peter Pan's handiwork. He was able to sneak on board the ship pretty easily with that ticking, as Captain Hook all of a sudden ran into a corridor and asked for everybody to be able to protect him. To which Peter stopped clicking and then hid in that little alleyway. After that, Peter releases the boys, and a ferocious battle ensues. What I find rather interesting is that Peter Pan actually draws some blood out of Hook, and even Hook is able to get a few little jabs here and there as well. In the end, it's the crocodile that ends up eating him, and that is the end of Captain Hook. A lot darker than how it happened in the movie, wouldn't you say? So in both, the battle was pretty furious, although pirates were killed instead of being scared off like in the movie. But basically, the ship is completely cleared, to which both of them take over, and use it as a means to be able to get back home. So in the movie, the entire ship is laden with pixie dust so that they can fly off. Here, though, the ship goes quite a distance into the ocean to make it so they don't have to fly so far to be able to get back into the real world. There's a bit of a rather dark edge here as well. So Peter and Tinkerbell fly on ahead. He wants to have all of them stay with him forever. So he closes and then bars the window to their house as a way of saying, yeah, they don't want you anymore. But after about 3 minutes of this, he just felt way too guilty about doing it and decides to just let them go on as usual. When the kids return, they see that the mother is lying there peacefully, so they decide just to sneak back into their own beds and just wake up as if nothing happened. However, there's a bit of a breeze, and the mother ends up waking up and is just ecstatic at the idea that the kids finally came back. In fact, Mr. Darling is very happy about this as well. Unlike the movie, where the Lost Boys do not come along with Wendy, John, and Michael, the Lost Boys actually walk up the stairs and knock on the door as a way to try to be a little more formal in asking, hey, can you take care of us? Can you be our parents? At that point, Mr. and Mrs. Darling just didn't care. They were so happy to have their family back that they were just like, sure, if this is the one thing that's going to keep them here, let's do it. However, Peter shows up one last time and asks Wendy to come back with her, to which the mother is very adamant about this. No, I just got you back. You've been gone for so long. Don't leave me again. To which Peter irons out a compromise, saying he'll come back in the spring for spring cleaning. And then from there, the book honestly kind of takes a pretty dark turn. Peter tries his best to be able to come back every spring, but being rather forgetful in nature, sometimes skips a few years. The Lost Boys start to regret their decision in coming to the real world because they realize that growing up is just awful, and they rather have listened to Peter and go back to Neverland. However, in growing up, they lost their ability to fly, and they just became boring adults. Wendy and Michael were able to fly back and forth to Neverland a little bit, but after enough time, this ability got lost to them as well. And then, for a span of several years, Peter didn't come back. It wasn't until Wendy was old enough to be able to have her own daughter, Jane, that Peter came back. Now, what's rather interesting is that Peter still recognized Wendy, even though she was fully grown. However, Peter realizes that Wendy wouldn't be able to fly anymore, and then asks Jane to be able to come with him back to Neverland, to which Wendy says, sure, why not? And then they hint at the idea of Jane having her own daughter named Margaret, who would later go on these same adventures as well. And that is where Peter and Wendy ends. Now on to Peter Pan in Kensington. As I said, this is basically the origin story, which is touched upon in Peter and Wendy. Peter didn't want to grow up, so he ran away into Kensington Park. Now what is rather fascinating here is that Barrie says all children are basically born as birds. And the main reason that birds can fly throughout their whole life is because they will never doubt their abilities. It mentions that if a human ever doubts their ability to fly again, they never will. So Peter flies to Kensington Park onto this little island inhabited by a whole bunch of crows. To which the crows burst his bubble right away, basically saying, yeah, you're a human, and then he can never fly again. This is just weird because it's already been proven that Peter can fly already, so what happened there? Peter was able to make very good friends with the fairies, and they were able to grant him a wish. And the wish was that he would be able to fly. Originally, he wanted this wish to be able to go back to see his mother. But after several trips back, the mother completely forgot about him and replaced him with another child. To which Peter is heartbroken and just went back to living back in Kensington Garden. And yeah, that's basically about it. There's a few little adventures here and there, and Peter even has a goat which he uses to ride around the park. And the only last thing to mention is that, so I already established the origin of the Lost Boys. They would show up in Kensington Park. However, it would often get cold in the winter, and Peter wouldn't be able to save some of these kids, so he used this goat to be able to walk around the park pretty quickly, and then bury those that he couldn't save in time. And that's about it. While this may look like a pretty short book, it is very densely packed. There are a lot of details that I cut out, and even Barrie admits to cutting out a few details as well. While the story was interesting, it just didn't grab me. In fact, I had to force myself in order to be able to finish this book. There were a few sections that were exciting, but on the whole, I was just kind of like, So probably the last thing to mention is the idea of Wendy's daughter, Jane. This adventure was actually made in Return to Neverland. And just as a way to date myself, I actually remember seeing this one in theaters. I do like the idea that this adventure was actually chronicled. Although it does seem weird to be able to make a sequel to a movie about 50 years later. I'm not going to get too far into the story, but I find it interesting that Jane is basically a stuffy grown-up because she is growing up in the midst of World War II and had to grow up in a hurry after her father left the house and he left her in charge. But probably one of the things I find interesting, so if this is anything to go on, Wendy was probably born in the 1890s and went to Neverland in the early 1900s. Jane was probably born in the 30s and went to Neverland during the height of Nazi bombardment, which was probably in the early 1940s. So going from those numbers, Margaret would have been born in the 1980s and then would have went to Neverland in the 90s. I feel like there could actually be some potential there, seeing that people are being more nostalgic for the 90s now. This is kind of a long one, so I figure I better just wrap this up. If you're curious about the origins of Peter Pan, go for it. But as for a personal recommendation, I just really can't do that, as there were sections that were good, but there were a few times I'm just kind of like, gotta read it again. Next chapter. Yeah, another page to go. How much longer is this? I hope you will join me next time, where we go over another fantasy novel, The Last Unicorn. Until next time, keep having fun.